Hello and welcome to the MCQ lecture series. In today's class, I'll be talking about multiple choice questions with respect to financial systems 1, which is the SYBA economics general paper. So let's get started. The first MCQ is Dash Bank was nationalized under SBI Act of 1955. So we have to guess which bank was nationalized under the SBI Act of 1955, and the underlying options are Imperial Bank of India, Merchant Bank, then British Bank, and none of the above. So here you have to know a little bit of historical perspective of the State Bank of India to solve this MCQ, because if you remember, the State Bank of India was formed due to the amalgamation of the three banks, which is the Bank of Bombay, Kolkata and Madras, which led to the formation of Imperial Bank of India, and this Imperial Bank of India was nationalized by the SBI Act of 1955 to form the State Bank of India. So therefore the correct answer here is Imperial Bank of India was nationalized by or under the State Bank of India Act of 1955. So this is the correct option, option A. Let us now move to the next question, which is in July 1969 dash banks were nationalized. We want the number of banks which were nationalized. Here we are not going to ask questions related to the name of the banks which were nationalized. That question will be a really difficult question, because you'll have to memorize all the 14 banks which were nationalized, and therefore the correct option here is that 14 banks were nationalized, and the correct option here is option A, because option A is talking about 14, option B is talking about 15, option C is talking about 16, and option D is talking about 17. So therefore the correct option is in July 1969. Here I am looking at July 1969. How many banks were nationalized? There were 14 banks which were nationalized. Let us now move to the next MCQ, which is talking about on 15th of April 1980. Again, in 1980, if you remember that historically nationalization took place in 1969 as well as 1980, and therefore how many banks were nationalized in the 1980s? And the underlying options are A2, B4, C6 and D8. You will have close options because this is a really simple question, and therefore to make it a little bit difficult, they give you very close options, and therefore here the correct option or correct answer is C6, which is 6 banks were nationalized in 1980s. So whenever you have question with respect to 1969, therefore 14 banks were nationalized in 1969, and in 1980s there were 6 banks. Let us now move to, I hope the idea is pretty much clear. Let us now move to the next question. In April 2019, this is a current affair sort of a question with respect to your syllabus. In April 2019, Dena Bank and Vijaya Bank were merged with which bank? And the underlying options are A, SBI, B, Bank of Baroda, C, Axis Bank, and D, none of the above. So here it is a factual sort of a question. You have to remember this, that Dena Bank and Vijaya Bank were merged with Bank of Baroda, which is option B, in April 2019, and therefore option B is the correct answer, which is Bank of Baroda. Let us now move to the next MCQ, which is talking about a not sort of a question. Which of the following is not a private bank or private sector bank in India? And the underlying options are A, Axis Bank, B, ICICI Bank, C, Kotak Mahindra Bank, and D, SBI. And here all these three are more or less private sector banks in India. Here I am asking which is not a private sector bank, and you have to be really careful while reading the question, which is not a private sector bank, and therefore SBI is not. SBI is rather a public sector bank. I hope the idea is clear. Let us now move to the next MCQ, which is again a not sort of a question. The banks which were not nationalized in 1969 and 1980s were known as what? So this is again a not sort of a question. The banks which were not nationalized in the 1969 and 1980s were known as what? A, old private sector bank or old generation private sector banks, new private sector banks or new generation private sector banks, C, foreign banks, and D, none of the above. So here the correct answer is A, old generation private sector banks or old private sector banks. So those banks which are not nationalized in 69 and 1980s are called as old generation private sector banks. So I hope the idea of this MCQ is pretty much clear. Let us now move to the last MCQ in this session, which is talking about the banks which came in operation after 1991 reforms are called as what? So these banks are called as A, foreign banks, or B, new private sector banks, or C, old private sector banks, or D, none of the above. So now we know old private sector banks are those banks which were not nationalized in 69 and 80s. That means they were present in the 1969 as well as 1980s. Here I am looking at those banks which came in operation after the 1991. So therefore it can be A, foreign banks, or B, private sector banks, and therefore the correct option here is B, private sector banks. So this is how you can solve MCQs with respect to financial systems, which is the SYBA general economics paper for third semester. Please stay tuned. I'll be making more videos with respect to the same. Thank you.